if you think you could feel better than you currently do, then that's a good sign to make sure you're steadying your glucose levels.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together.
Jessie, welcome to the Commune podcast. Such a treat to be with you.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm super happy to be with you too.
Not a sugary treat.
No,
just a
savory treat.
To be with you.
That's a good one. I like it.
Well, félicitations.
Merci.
Congratulations on your new book, The Glucose Goddess Method. So I know the gestation period of books, although you seem to have accelerated that gestation period preternaturally, but congratulations nonetheless. It's amazing.
Thank you. No, it's been a wonderful project to birth.
Yes, indeed. You know, there's just in the United States, there's nearly 100 million people that are pre-diabetic, and 90% don't know it.
Yeah.
And I was one of them.
How did you find out, Jeff, in the first place?
Well, for me, I honestly slapped on a continuous glucose monitor because I didn't have the intuition in my own body at that juncture to isolate or identify, areas of dysregulation like brain fog or crashes or chronic fatigue. I wasn't as attuned to my body. Now I don't have to wear it all the time to kind of know, like, ooh, I kind of fell off here a little bit. But for me, it was highly instructive, for people that aren't going to wear a continuous glucose monitor or perhaps haven't refined their own intuition on their body, like what's the best testing to find out that information. So, we can go backwards and forwards over the conversation and keep it pretty organic, but is there any kind of testing that you would recommend if people have an inkling that they may be pre-diabetic or running spikes?
Yes, I think there's sort of two big buckets to separate out here. So there's, having type 2 diabetes, having prediabetes, and that will be usually diagnosed by your doctor. And if you're being followed, once a year by a practitioner, they should be testing your fasting glucose levels once a year. And they might then diagnose, you with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. But then, and that's about 1 billion people in the world, Jeff, today who have type 2 or prediabetes.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's really, really common. And then, so if you have prediabetes or type 2, 100%, I'm going to teach you lots of cool stuff about glucose levels that can help you put it in remission like you did. But then, for the rest of us who don't have a clinically diagnosed prediabetes, of course, yearly testing is still going to be helpful. You can even test fasting insulin, which is a much better predictor of how far along the type 2 diabetes road you are or how close you are to developing it. But then, and this I think is a big part of my work, is also teaching people that even if you don't have prediabetes and your glucose levels are in the, normal optimal range, you might still be experiencing sort of transient high glucose levels, glucose spikes on a daily basis. Right. And so why do these spikes matter? Well, one, because the more spikes you have, the more you're going to inch towards that prediabetes diagnosis. So you need to manage those to avoid developing it. But second, because science is now showing us that these spikes actually lead to many symptoms that most of us feel on a day-to-day basis, like cravings, brain fog, unsteady energy. Glucose levels are really connected to your hormonal system. So there's lots of stuff going on there, which is quite fascinating. And some studies across the world have been showing or estimating that about 80% of people who do not have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes are still getting these spikes into very high ranges from pretty common foods. So all this to say, and this is my work, is like we should all care about our glucose levels, either because we have a condition we want to improve or because we want to not get it or because we want to just have endless energy and feel really good. So everybody should care.
Absolutely. And obviously, glucose spikes are very associated with the consumption of certain kinds of foods.
Yes.
And we can talk about that. But it's also, you can spike glucose levels from chronic stress. I actually started to spike from consistent sauna use.
Interesting. Is it because it dehydrates you? And then your blood becomes more concentrated. That's interesting.
That's exactly it. Yeah. You nailed it.
You're not drinking enough water, Jeff.
Well, that was the protocol, which is, I would see these huge spikes, and I was scratching my head, and I was like, "What is that?" And then I eventually began to isolate it during sauna time. And you're absolutely right. Basically, I was getting dehydrated, so my overall blood volume was decreasing, so the concentration in everything in it was increasing. And I also saw that with exercise. So,
Yes. And so these are the cases where the spikes are not actually bad, right? So it's
okay,
quite
that's what
tricky.
I was going to ask you.
Yeah. So,
I was going to ask you that.
So the spikes, for example, the exercise spike is a really good question, because if you're wearing a glucose monitor and you learned, okay, I should avoid the spikes, and then you go for a run or something and you see a big spike, you're like, oh my God, should I stop exercising? So, and also we can talk about this after, but wine or alcohol keeps your glucose levels really low. So you're like, okay, I should stop working out and just drink all day, and then my glucose levels will be steady. God. But no, that's not the case. And the yeah, I know, right? And so the exercise spike is quite interesting. So why do we sometimes see this spike when we're activating our muscles very strongly? It's simply because your muscles, like every other thing in your body, they need glucose for energy, and they love using glucose for energy. And so if you're doing a really hard workout, your liver is going to release some glucose into your bloodstream to feed your muscles. And you see that also with stress, for example. So the biggest spike I ever saw was when I did a big presentation in front of loads of people, and I saw a huge spike because that was stress. And that was my liver releasing glucose into my blood to give me fuel to run away from the, invisible lion. So your body is going to be doing some fun stuff with your glucose levels. But in the case of exercise, even though that spike does have the bad side effects of glucose spikes, namely inflammation and glycation, the overall positive impact of exercise is still very positive, because all of the benefits completely outweigh those issues. So don't worry, exercise even if you see a spike.
Great. Okay, that's really helpful, because I didn't really want to suspend my exercise regime.
Yeah.
I love tennis too much, and that's where I was really seeing it was, after playing tennis, and then I'd look at my app and I'd be like, oh my God, no more tennis. But no, you've assuaged my concern there.
Perfect.
But we need the glucose, right? I mean, it's tempting to villainize glucose, right? And we hear a lot about it in health circles now. But the body needs glucose, right? And, I believe there are certain brain cells that can only function or produce energy with glucose.
And your red blood cells as well. So yes, okay. Your body loves running on glucose. It's your body's favorite fuel. And a lot of our body parts can actually turn to using fat for fuel. But if glucose is around, your body will happily use it. And it gives you sort of express energy. It's very explosive, very rapid energy. And as humans, the main way that we give this glucose to our body is by eating specific foods, as you mentioned. So starchy foods like bread, rice, potatoes, pasta, and sweet foods. So anything that tastes sweet, from an apple to chocolate ice cream. And I like using this image, which is the image of a plant. So if you're taking care of a plant, to give the plant some water. But if you give the plant too much water, the plant will drown and die. Well, the human body is kind of similar in the sense that it loves having some glucose to run on. But if you give your body too much glucose too quickly, then your body is not happy and problems start happening. So some glucose is fine, but the problem is most of us are just giving too much to our body.
Yeah, I mean, that is the modern way, right? I mean, culture, in many ways has hijacked our evolution.
Mm-hmm.
So, we were used to having periods of abundance where we would have more glucose in our blood, and then periods of scarcity, which would trigger other kinds of pathways. So insulin always has its counterpart, glucagon, from the pancreas, for example. And in low glycemic states on the Serengeti, that would, as you say, at the end of the book, I found it actually fascinating. You talk about cravings a little bit, and you kind of bore into the adaptive mechanisms of evolution. You say basically hunger stemming from a low glycemic state on the Serengeti meant like, okay, you got to go find some food, and guess what? The liver can release glycogen now and even make glucose from component parts called gluconeogenesis. So our body is evolved that way so beautifully. But now, in 2023, that craving isn't really coming from a biological need. It's coming from these crashes, right? And then, of course, then we have that craving, and then we go to fulfill that craving. And you have some great tips about how to deal with cravings, and not to get ahead of ourselves, but I thought it was really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating. And the study that really shifted our understanding of cravings was done at Yale. I believe it's a 2018 study, and they put... and bless these researchers. I mean, they come up with the most incredible experiments. So they placed participants in an fMRI scanner, the big machines that, image your brain. And while the participants were in the scanner, scientists showed them on a screen photos of, crave-worthy foods like cookies and burgers and stuff. And they asked the participants to rate how much they wanted to eat those foods. And at the same time, the participants were hooked up to a machine that was measuring their glucose levels. And the scientists found something amazing. They found that when people's glucose levels were, steady and at a stable, normal range, people didn't really rate those foods very highly. They were not really drawn to eating them. But then, when the participants' glucose levels were low, all of a sudden, they were like, 10 out of 10 cookie, 10 out of 10 the burger, I need it. And the scanner revealed that the part of their brain that is responsible for cravings was activating and flashing up like crazy. And this low glucose state, yes, in the past, we would only get to that point of really low glucose levels because we hadn't eaten in 4 days. But today, after a big glucose spike, it is very common to experience also this big crash in glucose, which can put you at that low glycemic state, which makes you crave more starches and sugars. And then what do? You eat a cookie because you're like, I need sugar right now. And then another big spike happens. And after that huge spike, a huge drop. And bam, you're right back in that cravings place. And that's really the glucose roller coaster that many of us are on. And we don't even know, that this is coming from our glucose levels. We just think, oh, I'm just somebody who has cravings. I'm just somebody who doesn't have enough willpower to resist them. Well, that's the thing. It's like, actually, if you fix the underlying issue, a lot of these things go away. And it's quite it's quite a quick and remarkable transition to go through.
Yeah, you do such a beautiful job communicating in general, but specifically on Instagram, kind of demonstrating what healthy rolling hills of glucose look like versus kind of the spikes of the Alps or the Andes or the Rockies. You want to avoid the Rockies and the Andes when it comes to glucose levels. But one thing that you mentioned in the book around cravings is that because of these adaptive mechanisms, our body has the ability to essentially provide its own glucose to a certain extent. And so if you have a craving, and this is not always easy to do, but just wait 20 minutes, right? And your liver will take care of the craving on its own.
That's step one. Yeah, it's like when you're having a craving, I recommend you set a little timer for 20 minutes and you tell yourself, okay, if in 20 minutes I still crave that food, I'll eat it. But sometimes within those 20 minutes, your liver releases glucose, your glucose levels come back up, so that craving is less activated. But now you already have the thought of the chocolate cake. And so to me, I just find it really tough when I was like, I need that cake, to then, even if, you know, physiologically I'm not craving it anymore, I just kind of want the taste. So a better solution is to try to avoid those spikes in the first place, you know, so that you don't even think about the chocolate cake. That's how I see it.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I'm an intermittent faster, and I'm always putting myself through the process of trying to delineate between biological need and psychological desire.
How do you do it? I find it really hard.
It is really hard. I mean, you know, honestly, it's very tied into a meditation practice where, for me anyways, where I can kind of step back and witness phenomena arising moment to moment and not just be identified with it or fixated on it or be carried away by it. So, you know, fasting has a lot of biological benefits, and this is not an episode on fasting necessarily, but there is also sort of a spiritual component to it, which is, you know, the craving not to crave, which of course is a paradox. And one of the ways at that is trying to cultivate that space, as Viktor Frankl says, between stimulus and response, right? So if you can cultivate that space and then try to pull apart, you know, what is a need and what is a desire? What do I actually really need, and what is just pleasure? That's very hard, but it's you know, like anything else. You know, we go to the gym, we have all these different regimes for hypertrophy and to grow muscle and to grow cardiovascular health. Well, we can apply that same theory to our psychological or mental fitness, and you know, sometimes that helps when we're trying to find that space.
It does, but I would also say, you know, when you're getting this biological response because of the glucose roller coaster of being exhausted or having this strong craving because of these spikes and these dips, like, it's really hard to just find any, I find, and I used to be on this roller coaster nonstop, I found it really hard to find any space to really try to pause and not give into it, because yes, our mind is powerful, but our body is really powerful too. And when it's like a, you know, it's a physiological thing going on, it's quite hard to just witness.
Exert top-down pressure.
Exactly.
97% of our lives is bottom-up.
Yeah, and I hear a lot of stories of people who feel really bad because they feel like they don't have enough willpower, or they don't have that sort of mind training that you're talking about. And they feel quite helpless and hopeless. And in those cases, it's much easier to start developing that mental meditation practice if your glucose levels are steady and you're not trying to fight this like monster happening underneath your skin. So I would say, like, steady your glucose first, and then, you know, become as powerful as you, Jeff, that doing this work. But if you're like nonstop eating starches and sugars all day, it's going to be real hard for you to try to just control it without fixing the biological thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So for folks that don't have a continuous glucose monitor, which is the overwhelming majority of people, what would be some of the primary symptoms of chronic glucose spikes?
The primary symptoms are cravings, as we just talked about. So feeling like you want to eat sweet things mid-morning, mid-afternoon, after dinner, getting these really intense hunger pangs where anything around you that is food, you might just want to jump on it. You know, a bag of crisps, like you see a vending machine, you walk past a bakery, and just these urges that control you in terms of wanting to eat carbs. That's a very common symptom of the roller coaster. A second one that is related is just constant hunger. So feeling like you need to eat every couple of hours. That is a very clear sign that your body is dependent on these glucose spikes to make energy. So you have breakfast, 2 hours later you're starving. Then you have lunch, and 2 hours later you're starving, and you're just eating all day. And when you steady your glucose levels, you're able much more easily to go for, 4, 5, 6 hours without eating, without it feeling like a biological emergency to your body to get some more food. And then I think energy is something that is so interesting to unpack, because when you're experiencing glucose spikes, your energy levels go up and down all the time. So you feel fatigued, you feel tired mid-morning, you need coffee, you just have a hard time, going through the day, going grocery shopping, and like everything feels really sluggish. And what's really cool is that the science shows us that what's actually happening every time you have a glucose spike is that the little factories in your cells, your mitochondria, are actually taking a pretty big hit, and they become stressed out by this big glucose spike. And instead of being able to transform that glucose into energy, which is their job and their function, that big influx of glucose just makes them, go on strike, as the French would do. And those mitochondria striking, you feel that as this chronic fatigue. So you're still eating the foods that you were told give you energy, like breakfast cereal, orange juice. But on the inside, long term, your body's ability to make energy is being compromised. So that's a really interesting and common symptom of this glucose roller coaster. Then there are other symptoms that, depending on who you are, your body, your medical history, you might see them or not. Brain fog is a big one. So when your neurons experience this glucose roller coaster, you can feel it as brain fog, as the information between them gets slowed down. You might see fertility problems. So, no ovulating, missed periods, difficult menopause symptoms. You might see balding on the head if you're female, etc. You might also see skin issues like rosacea, psoriasis, eczema, which are all inflammation-based issues. And those glucose spikes increase inflammation drastically. And then long-term, as we mentioned, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes. But also, we're starting to understand that a lot of chronic issues get much better when you get your glucose levels down, like heart disease, like Alzheimer's, like cancer. So, in conclusion, if you think you could feel better than you currently do, then that's a good sign to make sure you're steadying your glucose levels. That's how I see it.
Yeah. The moral of the story is don't raise the retirement age on the mitochondria or they'll go on strike. Right?
Well, actually, your mitochondria, what's cool about them is that even if they've been damaged by this stress, they can regenerate. So you can always get all of your capacity back. And so nothing is fatal, nothing is forever. And you can retrain them and they come back. So that's good.
That is good. Yeah, there's all sorts of praxis around mitobiogenesis and even mitophagy, which is sort of the mitochondrial version of autophagy.
How do you do that?
Well, fasting is one way. There's also, David Sinclair, who's the big kind of, lifespan guy, is all about, some of these polyphenols that trigger the sirtuin pathway, that upregulates repair pathways, so autophagy, mitobiogenesis. I've also heard and seen some data around deliberate cold therapy, ice baths and cold showers that activate brown fat. So as a process of thermoneogenesis, essentially the body's innate capability to upregulate its temperature into that Goldilocks zone that activates mitochondria in a certain kind of fat. It's actually brown because it's so rich in mitochondria.
Really?
Because there's some enzyme that has a lot of iron connected to it. It's the, I'll never remember. It's the CCO, that enzyme. Cytochroma. I won't get it here, but it has a lot of iron connected to it, and iron makes it brown. So the prevalence of mitochondria in brown fat makes it literally brown.
Oh, fascinating! I did not know that.
And it can actually beige your white visceral fat. So and we can get into adiposity and blood sugar, and but anyway, so I'm a cold bather. even though I absolutely abhor it. But I will do it in the morning in a low glycemic state often, because my body will have no choice at that juncture but to burn fat.
Smart. And do you really hate it, or do you just hate the first 10 seconds?
Like anything, you train yourself to sort of placate. But yeah, I don't tolerate cold super well. Like, I'm not one of those people that would just jump into the cold lake, without a lot of hand wringing before. Eventually I would do it, probably more out of peer pressure than anything else. But no, now I've gotten accustomed to it, but I don't spend more than 60 to 90 seconds at a time under a cold stream of water.
Oh,
I actually
really?
find it
even in
easier.
The shower?
Yeah, I actually find it easier to cold plunge, to completely submerge my body, because it's the sort of the attack of the shower that feels more onerous than just steadying my mind and just getting fully in.
That's so fascinating. For me, it's the total opposite. Once I'm in a freezing cold shower, I can stay there. I start really liking it. After 10 seconds, I'm like, oh, this feels nice and doesn't even feel cold anymore. But the cold plunge for me is super hard. But also the cold plunge, I think, is colder, because no matter how cold you make a shower, it's never going to be as cold as an ice bath. True.
Wim Hof came and visited for about 3 weeks, and he was keen to get a commercial ice delivery every morning. So we would fill the plunge, and we would, the temperatures were, just above freezing, essentially 35 degrees. That was really, really hard. But there's plenty of data that shows that, water that's even in the high 50s can have a very health conferring impact. And unlike sauna, where there's a lot of data around specific temperature ranges, deliberate cold therapy seems to be more subjective. It's more about what you feel is cold. And I think you kind of train yourself up, and, you'll hit a certain wall, and then you're overcome that wall.
But so you don't like it while it's happening, but then do you feel good afterwards?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I love it. The feeling is so invigorating. It is more invigorating than a cup of coffee. And of course, in some ways what you're doing is triggering some of your fight or flight sympathetic responses. So, you're getting a big jolt of epinephrine, and it can make you feel super alert. So it's actually if you're going into a learning phase or a learning bout where you're trying to sit down and learn how to play piano or write a book or something, there's a lot of people that say do a cold bath or cold shower before, because that will get you alert to that. For an ultradian cycle, I think they call it. It's a 90-minute cycle.
Interesting. Okay, I'll have to try that next time I'm writing
next
a book.
Although you might need a break.
I don't know. It's interesting because I'm always doing all these projects, and while I'm doing that, I love it. And then towards the end, I'm like, wow, this is really hard. And then 2 days later, I'm like, okay, so what's next? I don't get a hangover of projects. It's wonderful.
That reminds me of Skylar, my wife. All of our children were born at home, and our second child, it was a sort of tumultuous affair where the midwife was double booked and didn't show up. Anyways, that's a whole other podcast. But the second she said, I don't think I can do this, I was like, uh-oh, it's coming. And then certainly 2 minutes later, our little baby girl was born, and Skylar looked up at me, kind of batted her eyes, and she said, and this is so strange, but she said it, she said, let's have another.
Oh my God.
So I think you're going through the same phenomenon with your book. You're like, let's have another. This one's not even out yet.
Oh my God. Oh, that's so sweet.
Anyways, so you talk about, mitochondria being overwhelmed by an inflow of too much glucose, and then it says stop, and cells become essentially insulin resistant. They stop accepting glucose or qualify. Yeah.
But then the insulin thing is a parallel process. So every time your glucose levels are high, like during a glucose spike, your body knows that it's not good. Your body's like, okay, bad shit's happening. The mitochondria are not happy. Like, let's get this glucose down. And so what it does is that your pancreas sends out insulin, and insulin takes the extra glucose and puts it away in different places. So in your liver, in your muscles, and in your fat cells. And, insulin gets such a bad rep as well, but it's like, no guys, without insulin you die. Like, people who don't have the ability to make insulin, they have to inject themselves several times a day because otherwise their body really shuts down. So insulin is super helpful in this case, and insulin gets that glucose level down. But the problem is, over time, just like when I was a student and I started drinking 1 cup of coffee and I was like, wow, this stuff is so cool. And then after a year, I'm like drinking 5 cups to just wake up. I became resistant to coffee, and your cells do the same thing. They become resistant to insulin. That's the process. Yeah.
That's the process. That's really helpful. So these are 2 parallel processes. Essentially, over nutrition at the mitochondrial level will create an abundance of free radicals, hydrogen peroxide, hydroxyls, essentially these molecules that have like an extra electron that becomes super reactive, and then they can cause all sorts of havoc. And
they can mutate your DNA. They can poke holes in your cells. Like, it's not great.
Right. Well, this is actually, you point this out in the book, and I thought this was fascinating. When you create a more like a direct link between blood sugar dysregulation and cancer, for example. I was trying to kind of understand what the mechanism there is, and I can trace some of that around, but I think the point that you made, which I thought was right on, which is that the overproduction of these reactive oxygen species at the mitochondrial level can cause DNA to dysfunction.
That's one of the possibilities, right? I'm not saying it always does, but it definitely can cause some mutations that can kick off, cancer. But also, just over time, that huge amount of inflammation in your body, that's a big driver of cancer, right? Cancer is an inflammation-based disease. So the more inflammation you have, the more you're going to have your cancer spread. And so it's just important for so many aspects of health to make sure you're not in that state of hyperinsulinemia. It's really, really a huge driver of so many problems. And Benjamin Bickman had written this great book, Why We Get Sick, and he talks about insulin and how it's such a root cause of so many chronic diseases, and even heart disease. Now we're starting to learn, no, it's not the eggs, guys. It's the sugar, it's the insulin. No, for sure. I mean, you talk about this process of glycation, for example. So just to set that table again, when you have excess glucose in your bloodstream, a number of different things can happen. You already mentioned, it can get stored as glycogen for a rainy day, kind of stockpiled in the liver. Okay, great. It can get stored as triglycerides in fat cells, which is not necessarily a bad thing because we need stored energy. But if that is too prevalent, you don't want too much visceral stored fat, basically, or stored energy there. But then another option, it seems like, for excess blood sugar is glycation. So can you explain that process? What is glycation, and why is it so dangerous? And I will also add one thing. So you can also store excess glucose as glycogen in your muscles as well. And those are a huge store of glucose. Yeah. So they're like the most amazing. Muscles are amazing at soaking up the extra glucose, but they get full. So afterwards it goes to fat cells. So glycation. Very interesting process. And it's the third process that I touch on in the book, and that I explain happens when a glucose spike takes place. So glycation is the process of a chicken going from pink to cooked when you put it in the oven. Okay? Glycation is cooking. Or a piece of toast in the toaster that goes from, not toasted to toasted. That's glycation.
Right.
And so this is going to sound really wild, but it's true. From the moment a human is born, they slowly cook, they slowly glycate, and then when they're fully glycated, they die, essentially. So as a human being, you are glycating. And what's interesting is that this glycation is also similar to aging. So the faster you glycate, the faster you cook, the faster you age. Okay, and this aging shows on your skin as wrinkles, for example, but it also slowly deteriorates your organs on the inside. And so glycation sounds a lot like glucose, and it's because glucose does this glycation process. So anytime a glucose molecule in your body bumps into another molecule, it damages it, it glycates it. And then once the molecule is glycated, you can't unglycate it. And the more excess glucose you have, so the more glucose spikes you have, the faster this process is happening because the more glucose molecules are just around to do it. And that's why the more glucose spikes you have, the faster you age. There you have it.
I hope I'm medium rare and not well done at this point.
I love it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've heard of these compounds called advanced glycation end products, known as AGEs, which is an acronym that kind of fits the bill, where, for example, like hemoglobin, which is, the molecule in your red blood cells that's responsible for bringing oxygen to your cells, is a protein. It's a certain kind of protein. And that essentially when it gets glycated, it creates this sort of glycoprotein that can be very inflammatory in your vascular system. So, for example, you mentioned before, it's not the eggs or dairy or high saturated fat necessarily that's causing heart disease. It's inflammation in the vascular system that then allows these kind of small LDL particles to get lodged in the arterial walls and then become oxidized and form foams and plaques, etc. And that can be a downstream cause from having too much glycation or too much inflammation. So it's
and
really
something else that I want to mention is that, so we talked about, starches and sugars being the two main sources of glucose. But there's something I didn't say yet, which is that starches just contain glucose, but anything that is sweet contains glucose and fructose.
Yeah.
And that's really key because fructose glycates things even more than glucose does. And so because fructose always goes hand in hand with glucose in sweet foods, because together they form table sugar, essentially. Table sugar is half glucose, half fructose. Well, when you steady your glucose levels and you just focus on this glucose thing, you're also naturally steadying or reducing how much fructose you're intaking. And so a big benefit of this steady glucose approach is getting that amount of fructose also down.
Yeah. In fact, there's a couple books that came out last year, one by David Perlmutter and another by Rick Johnson, that looked specifically at fructose as triggering this uric acid pathway that essentially tells your cells to become insulin resistant and store fat. And again, Rick Johnson's book is a great title. It calls Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. Because nature, when scarcity was coming, when there was winter impending right around the bend, and you went out in the fall and gorged on a bunch of figs, and the fructose in those figs would then essentially tell your cells to be like, hey, don't take all this into the cells for energy production now. Save it because you're going to need it during these months of scarcity. And so much of the body works that way. It's just fascinating. It's like constantly self-regulating and trying to create these homeostasis between two kind of opposing forces.
Yes, and I love that you said that, because your body is just trying to keep you alive, right? Like all the stuff that happens is your body doing its best to try to just deal with what's going on. And something I hear also quite a bit is that, oh, my body hates me, my body's against me, or, my body's trying to sabotage me, etc. It's like, well, actually, a lot of the symptoms that you're experiencing, in my view, they're your body trying to communicate with you, trying to tell you something, trying to ask you to take care of what's going on inside. So once I was able to flip that in my own head and be like, oh, like all these mental health problems and just the brain fog and the fatigue, they're actually my body trying to speak to me. And that really changed so much for me.
Yeah. You mentioned fructose and glucose coming together to form sucrose. So anything with an ose, is that a fair assumption to say is a sugar or a carbohydrate? And where does that come from? Is that mostly plants? And what about lactose?
Lactose also breaks down to glucose. Yeah, I don't think you can say that any word that finishes in ose breaks down to glucose. But yeah, it's a very common one. It's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. Do all sugars that break down to glucose finish in ose? Probably, because I think the OSC refers to something specific. But yeah, I mean, the main sources of glucose in your body are going to be just the starch chains and the actual, sucrose. Those are the most abundant molecules that break down to glucose. There are other things that can break down to glucose or increase your glucose levels. For example, when you eat some protein, it can also have an impact on your glucose levels. Even fat to a small extent, but really the big guys here that we're looking at are starches and sugars.
Yeah. I mean, fats and carbohydrates actually share a lot of common properties just at the chemical level. I think, glucose is C6H12O6, if I remember.
Wow, nice.
From the old days. So it's essentially a long chain carbon molecule, and so are fats. And so, it's just like a couple hydrogens here and there.
It's wild how, when you look at it, it's all like the same atoms. You're like, oh, wow. Just a small rearrangement. I mean, it's the diamond and lead thing, right? It's like small rearrangements can just make a completely different material or substance. It's wild. Or tissue.
Yeah. And if you really want to brain freeze, you can realize that all of these elements came from the explosion of supernovas 8 billion years ago that cooked these elements in their inner cores and then exploded and vomited them all over the universe. And here we are talking about glucose.
Or that we're mostly empty space. That one trips me out too.
Totally. That the nucleus in cells or in atoms are like these tiny little things. In fact,
the rest is just nothing.
I think I read the nucleus in an atom is just metaphorically the same size as the grain of sand in Notre Dame Cathedral.
Stop.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And the rest of it is electrons spinning around, So yeah, you are very spacey. Don't let anyone tell you that. If someone says that, don't take it as an insult.
I'll be like, thanks, you too.
You too. And I can prove it. So we talked a little bit about the relationship between, chronic glucose spikes and cancer and diabetes, obviously. But a lot of people are calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. Why is that? What is the relationship here between glucose spikes and dementia and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's?
It's because we're starting to see, and when I say we, I mean scientists across the world are starting to see that Alzheimer's and dementia share a lot of similar things with type 2 diabetes. For instance, in the brain of somebody who has Alzheimer's or dementia, you see insulin resistance. in the brain cells, meaning they can't uptake energy effectively anymore. You see mitochondria dysfunction, which is what we talked about, happens in your cells when there's a big glucose spike going on. You see inflammation. You see glycation. And then statistics are showing us that if you have elevated glucose when you're 35 years old, you have a higher risk of getting dementia later on. And so the model of like Alzheimer's is this plaque-based disease that you can't do anything about is really shifting. And there's pretty good evidence showing us that, no, actually, it's a metabolic disease. And one really scary thing that happened last month is that somebody who was 18 years old got diagnosed with dementia. Whoa. And so I just wonder, and I hope this is not going to happen, but you know how type 2 diabetes used to be called late onset diabetes? Adult onset.
Right, yeah.
Well, I hope that we're not going to see something similar with dementia, where we always thought dementia is for people who are, at a late stage in their life. I hope it's not going to happen earlier and earlier as metabolic health gets worse. Yeah,
it is fascinating. I mean, our culture of overnutrition has had all of these very strange impacts. Like, for example, like puberty in females, like when girls get their period, used to be like 16, now it's 12.
It used to be 16?
So,
wow.
Yeah, not that long ago. I think it's maybe even like a couple hundred years ago.
Wow.
So then you scratch your head and you're like, well, what is going on there? And, could it be that because of overnutrition, our bodies basically tell our brains, like, well, in the case of a young woman, like, I have enough energy, stored energy now to go through the gauntlet of pregnancy. So, and this gets into like leptin. So, leptin is created in your fat cells. If you have an overabundance of fat cells, you're going to be creating a lot of leptin. Leptin is a hormone, a chemical messenger that then tells your brain. It's generally like often associated with a satiety, but really I think more what it does, it says like, we have enough, we're enough. We've got plenty of stockpiled stored energy here. So we're good, so we don't need to overconsume anything more. But I think that leptin might also be a signal that, I'm ready to have a baby. So anyways, this is just, of course, a theory, but
that's interesting. I wonder if that's interesting. Yeah, because you say overnutrition. To me, I feel like that's not the right term, because it's not just eating a lot. It's like eating a lot of processed, sugary stuff, right? Because if you're overfeeding on broccoli, you're not probably going to have this. Even if you're eating like 10,000 calories of broccoli, it's not going to be the same. So it's just like it's a shift in the quality of the nutrition and what the molecules we're eating are. I think that's like really at the core of all these changes.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. On that note, in terms of the overconsumption of certain molecules, what is the impact of the overconsumption of sugar on the gut?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. What I see in the studies is that when you start eating in a way that reduces how much sugar and processed foods you're eating, the gut lining improves, irritable bowel syndrome improves, bloating can improve. But specifically to the gut, if I recall, I believe that when you have a lot of sugar in your diet, a lot of the, bad microbes, bad bacteria overgrow in your gut, and a lot of the good bacteria die off. And so that's why it's so important that we bring back way more fiber and vegetables and those kinds of foods in our diet to feed that. But the gut is an area where I want to learn more. Like, I feel like I don't know fully everything there is to know about it. What do you know?
Well, only what I've read and through interviews. But there's I think one of the doors opened for me through this doctor named Will Bulsiewicz, who wrote a book called Fiber Fueled. And but subsequently, I've talked to many different gastroenterologists and other doctors and microbiome experts. I think what's fascinating is that, well, we coexist with these 39 trillion bacteria mostly in our colon, but now they're finding it actually in every organ and on our skin and in our nose, etc. But the overwhelming majority is there, in the colon, and fiber that doesn't get digested in the gut that moves through feeds these bacteria, and they produce their own metabolites or postbiotics. And kind of the most famous of which is butyrate. So this is like this short chain fatty acid. And butyrate can upregulate the kind of those tight junctions that maintain the integrity of the epithelial wall there in the gut that protects against leaky gut and inflammation. But butyrate can also upregulate insulin sensitivity. So it's pretty cool that if we feed, we'll talk about fiber in a minute because it's part of your protocols. But one of the other, besides just slowing down absorptions of carbohydrates in the small intestine, it seems to have this really fantastic impact on our bacteria. So that's one thing there.
We love it.
Yeah. So let's get into, I think we've fully established that glucose spikes are pretty detrimental to health. So maybe we can talk about some of the solutions that you propose in the book for controlling glucose spikes.
Yes, that's a good idea. Let's do that.
Let's do it.
Okay, so
where do you want to start?
Well, I think I want to start saying that what I've been doing over the past several years has been, reading all the cutting edge science in this topic, trying to figure out if there are ways and things we can do in our daily life to avoid those spikes and feel good. And so in my book, The Glucose Goddess Method, what I've done is I've taken the 4 most powerful principles to avoid these glucose spikes and start feeling better quite quickly, without doing anything, drastic, without cutting out any foods, because I love my pasta, I love my chocolate cake. So like the extreme diets are personally not going to work for me, and I want to offer people some steps that are really easy. So it's a 4-week plan, and it goes like this. Week 1, we look at breakfast, because it's very important for your glucose levels to have a savory breakfast, not a sweet breakfast. And we continue this breakfast for the full 4 weeks. And I have, tons of recipes, inspiration. It's very fun. And a savory breakfast is essentially a breakfast based around protein. That's the main tenet of it. And that doesn't contain anything sweet, except some whole fruit if you want. Then week 2, we incorporate.
Could I just say one thing? The savory jam. So you have a lot of recipes in it. Yes. Savory jam, that's a big star for me. 7-minute eggs, no spike granola. Those were my 3 check marks.
Oh, yay.
And for everyone, who's just listening, the recipes in the book around savory breakfast will change your mindset completely around breakfast. There'll be no more bagels, muffins, glucose spiking, granola, pancakes, none of that stuff. This is a much tastier and obviously healthy way to go. Yes.
Yeah, and also you feel so different, Jeff. When you switch, your entire day goes differently. And if you've always had a sweet breakfast, you don't even know how good you feel if you switch over to something more savory, right? And the granola recipe is a great example, because most granolas are full of sugar and carbs. And this version that I offer is like a glucose steady version. So even if you love granola, you can totally still have this version based around nuts with Greek yogurt and berries to enjoy it, but keep your glucose steady. So yeah, we start with breakfast because it's so powerful and important.
Great.
And then week 2, we incorporate 1 tablespoon of vinegar once a day. So first of all, how do you do it? And then I'll explain why the hell we do it. And so you do it by putting a tablespoon of vinegar. It can be any type of vinegar. in a big glass of water and having that once a day. Or I have lots of mocktail recipes, tea recipes, dressings. You can do it that way too. And the reason we add vinegar during the second week of the glucose goddess method is because vinegar contains a very powerful molecule. I'm going to quiz you, Jeff. Do you know the name of the molecule?
Well, I do. Acetic acid.
Yeah,
right?
there you go. Good job. And so acetic acid is really cool and powerful. And what it does is that it slows down how quickly starches break down to glucose in your digestive system. And vinegar, well, acetic acid, goes to your muscles. And remember how I said that your muscles are really good at storing that glycogen? Well, it tells your muscles to store even more than usual. So as a result, anything you eat afterwards that contains glucose is going to lead to a smaller spike. So as a result, your energy will be steadier, have fewer cravings, you'll feel better, it'll be helping your health and your hormones. So c'est tout bénef, like we say in French. It's all good.
Yeah, it's all good. Is there any kinds of vinegar that we should watch out for? Do we need pasteurized vinegar? Does any vinegar count? Apple cider? Help us out there.
You can do any type of vinegar, like apple cider, white wine vinegar, cherry vinegar, balsamic, except be careful with the very syrupy balsamic glazes that are more like, creams and syrups. Those are full of sugar, so those don't work. But otherwise, any vinegar works. And I recommend testing out a few of the little drink recipes and finding one that you like. For example, I just really got into white vinegar. I used to be an apple cider vinegar girl, and now I actually really like the white vinegar vibe. So just
I do too.
You do too? Yeah. It's
yeah.
a bit less intense as a taste, and if you get, you can try out different ones and see, which one resonates with your palate. But also the recipes are super nice. There's a hot cinnamon tea with vinegar that I love in week 2. There's a turmeric mocktail, which is super fun. So you'll find inspiration. And I encourage people to sort of make it a little ritual, have your little vinegar drink, help your glucose. It makes me feel so good now to drink that vinegar.
Right. So a tablespoon a day keeps the glucose spikes away.
Yes. We need to make a t-shirt.
Okay. Good. Are there any other foods that serve as glucose sinks or vacuums, if you will?
Sort of.
If you can't manage the vinegar. I mean, vinegar seems like that's the number one option.
Vinegar is the best option during the second week, but if you really can't manage it, you can swap it out for lemon juice. Now, lemon reduces glucose spikes through a different mechanism than the acetic acid in vinegar. But I know that for some people, it's just the vinegar thing just doesn't work. Or maybe your doctor told you, don't drink vinegar. And in that case, you can do the lemon option. But the word you said I love, any foods that are glucose vacuums. Well, in week 3, we incorporate a really wonderful substance, which is fiber that we just talked about. And so in week 3 of the method, what we do is we add a vegetable-based starter to one of our meals a day. So this can be very simple. It can be, some cherry tomatoes from your fridge, or it can be my favorite recipe, backwards broccoli, or it can be a ton of other. You like that one?
That was the one that I noted particularly. Also, just because of the method of making it. It's backwards.
It's backwards.
So
you don't put the broccoli in a pot of hot water. You put the hot water into a bowl of raw broccoli, and it's very cool. And I have to say, I love cooking, but also I'm quite lazy and I don't have a lot of time. So I wanted all these recipes to be 6 ingredients or less, things you can just whip up, super simple. And they're the things that I just cook every day to get my glucose hacks in. And I hope that that's how people will vacuum them up into their lives, and they'll become just staples and habits. That's the point. We're not here to do a complicated, once a month, Sunday roast recipe book. This is stuff to do every day to do these glucose hacks and feel better. And the rest of the time during the method, Jeff, apart from doing the 4 hacks in the glucose goddess method, you do whatever you want. You drink whatever you want, you eat whatever you want. It's not restrictive, you're not counting calories. You're simply adding these hacks in, sort of gentle giants in your day, and reaping the benefits and feeling better. But it's total freedom the rest of the time.
Yeah, you do such an amazing job talking about cadencing of consumption. So what foods to eat when. to limit glucose spikes, and you inspired me to do something very embarrassing. But now when I have like a date night with Skylar, where we'll have a glass of wine, and I'll bring like a little baggie of walnuts with me.
Nice. I love it.
And I'll pop them out and I'll eat some walnuts first before I drink my glass of wine. Why would I ever do something like that?
It's the glucose goddess's fault, but that's wonderful. No, because you're right. The nuts, they have fiber, they have protein, they have fat in them, and so those molecules really help reduce how quickly any glucose molecules coming down afterwards make it to your bloodstream. And that's the whole concept of this veggie starter. The fiber acts as a really amazing buffer or protective mesh so that any glucose molecules afterwards don't go through your bloodstream so much. And so the spike is smaller, even though you're still eating the same meal as usual, but you're actually even adding more food at the beginning.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's non-instinctual, but it makes total sense when you understand the mechanism. I love the way you describe that as the mesh, or like this lattice work that sort of aligns the small intestine, and it just says slow down.
Slow down. Exactly. No, it's making that intestinal wall, much thicker and more protective. And it's really cool to learn how, your biology can just do these things. I think it's wonderful. It's the interplay between your food and your body. It's really very wonderful. Yeah. And then finally,
I need fiber for my brain to slow down my thoughts.
Oh yeah. Ooh, what's that called?
I don't know. Maybe it's called meditation. I don't know. All right, let's get number 4.
Okay, number 4. So in week 4, you're doing the breakfast, vinegar, and fiber veggie starter, and then you add in 10 minutes of movement once a day after a meal. And this can be super simple movement. It can be going for a walk, cleaning your kitchen, doing some calf raises at your desk. Like, it doesn't have to be, intense workout with barbells and stuff. We're just talking simple stuff. You can watch TV and do some bicep curls with a bottle of water. Like, just make it super simple for yourself. But why do we do this? Because our muscles, as I mentioned, are really good at soaking up that extra glucose. And so when you use them for 10 minutes after a meal, a lot of the glucose from the meal is going to go and be used for energy by your mitochondria and your muscles, instead of hanging around and creating this big glucose spike. And so, again, you don't have to change what you're eating the rest of the time. Just by adding this movement after one of your meals a day, you're going to get way fewer of the symptoms of any glucose spikes that you might be experiencing.
Yeah, I have a bunch of different kooky rituals associated with kind of postprandial movement, and I get teased endlessly by my children. But anyways, I'll after dinner I'll drop and do like 50 push-ups. I know that's over the top. Not everyone's going to do that, but my kids are always like, there goes Dad with his push-ups.
Do you do it right after the meal? Because you can wait up to 90 minutes to do your movement.
Yeah, not generally not right after. Sometimes like you say, actually doing the dishes is actually a pretty good way. Absolutely. Because you're up and you're moving, you're going to the table, you're bringing things over, you're putting things away, you're drying, and it's also a nice family ritual. I've got my girls, and we all do it together, and that's nice. But when I'm violating my blue light clause and watching, some Netflix or something with my girls.
Oh my God, Jeff, you watch Netflix?
I know, it's coming out here. It's a scandal.
I love Netflix.
I know. Sorry, but I will to compensate. I will often be like on the ground, with rolling on some massage balls, or doing a few little, a little bit of resistance training, or a few push-ups, or just some core stuff, and I feel great. I mean, I'd like to go to sleep with my food as fully digested as it possibly can be. Mm-hmm. So then when I am actually go to sleep, I'm in a more or less fasted state. Yeah. And that can take like 3 hours unless you're helping move that process along. And so just going for like a walk after dinner is just the best thing.
Totally. So. And I relate to the TV thing. Like, I can't just watch TV. I have to be doing other things. So I'm either rolling a lacrosse ball under my foot, or I'm just like stretching, or I'm folding the laundry. You know, I can't just watch TV. I'm like, but what else am I need to do other stuff.
I know it. I'm the same way. You know, I feel like, oh, it's time scarcity. Like that, I have to parallel process here
Exactly.
to get the most out of life. So these are the 4 primary hacks that you talk about in this book. I know that in your previous book, there were, I think you had 10.
Yes,
but these are like
exactly.
the four like primary ones you can really, really focus on, and they're so simple. Like there's really, you can just integrate them into your life,
And they're common
without
sense, which
making
is cool.
yourself miserable. So
Absolutely. And, you know, actually, when you think about it, these hacks that we now understand the scientific basis for, and we can see through the studies how they work on the body and why they're so powerful, these are things that we've known for a long time. You know, cultural wisdom, ancestral wisdom is here. We never used to have sweet foods for breakfast. We always had just regular, you know, meat and potatoes or whatever we ate the rest of the day. There was no like dessert for breakfast. That is an invention. Vinegar has been used for centuries in so many cultures around the world as a health food. The veggie starter. I mean, in France, we have crudité, which is raw veggies at the beginning of a meal. In Italy, antipasti. You know, in the Middle East, they do herbs before the meals. Like, this is something we've known. And the moving after eating, like, the walking after a meal, I don't think there's anything that is more more culturally prevalent than going for a walk after eating. Like, I mean, so it's cool to me to realize that this cutting edge science is really connected to the ancestral wisdom, and that our bodies just soak them up and respond so well to these habits.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And you know, I think one of the other points that you made that towards the beginning of the book that I found to be really refreshing. In my case, the weight loss was sort of a happy byproduct.
Side effect. Yep.
Yeah. So can you talk about that just a little bit? Because I think it's important for people to hear.
Absolutely. So when you focus on your glucose levels and you avoid the spikes, the first thing that happens is that you feel better, right? Because you're doing this for your health. You're helping your mitochondria, you're helping your neurons, you're balancing your hormones, and, you know, giving your body all this extra energy that you might not have had for a very long time. So we're here for health. We're here to prevent dementia, to reverse type 2 diabetes, to, you know, clear up your skin, to help your brain fog. But then what happens as well is that because when you steady your glucose levels, your cravings dissipate, your hunger reduces, and insulin reduces, which means you're burning fat more often. What happens very often is that you also lose fat on your body as a consequence of those processes taking place. And to give you some numbers, so for the Glucose Goddess method, because I'm a scientist and I just love doing these sorts of things, I recruited 3,000 people in October 2022, and they all went through the method before anybody else, before I finished even writing the whole book. And 40% of them lost fat during these 4 weeks on their body. They lost weight. Even though they were eating more than usual, they were not counting calories, they didn't remove any foods from their diet, and they weren't even trying to lose weight. So just to show you that the obsession with weight loss at all cost and doing extreme diets and crazy stuff is not the way to go. Because if you naturally just help your health improve, if your body needs to lose weight, it will, just naturally, without you really trying. So I just want to really emphasize this point that we're here for health, and we're here to thrive and feel happy and feel good and have energy and be able to go after our dreams and spend time with those we love and feeling good in our body. And then the weight loss is a consequence.
Yeah. Thanks for underscoring that, Jessie. I think it's just really important because, you know, there are myriad weight loss programs and crash diets, etc. And they almost always fail.
Yeah.
Because people might lose weight temporarily, but in almost all cases, you put it back on.
Absolutely.
Because and this is really just more about a change in lifestyle such that you feel better and more energetic. And it has so many different ramifications in life. I mean, it's great for yourself, but it's also really great for the people around you. If you're bringing your best, vibrant self
I like that.
to your family and friends and community and coworkers day in and day out, you're going to get that energy back in your life. And, there's no accident to the fact that, I called this podcast and my company Commune, because the number one determinant for self-reported happiness and well-being is the strength of your social connections.
I love that. It's so true. Mm-hmm.
But you can't have really strong relationships if you are not able to bring your best self to that relationship.
Totally.
So
And also there's this amazing study, Jeff, that showed that in married couples, so researchers gave married people a voodoo doll representing their spouse. And they asked the participants, not joking, it's wild, to put a pin in the voodoo doll every time they felt irritated by their spouse. And then they looked at their glucose levels, and they found that people who experienced more glucose lows, right, which is what can happen after a spike, those people put way more pins in the voodoo dolls. So being on a glucose roller coaster can impact how irritated you feel around the house. And this thing of being hangry, being hungry and angry, which I used to have all the time. That's such a very clear sign that you're on this glucose roller coaster, and that your body is just being thrown up and down, and you just your personality changes. So I love that you just said this. When you learn to balance your glucose level, it's a really positive step for people to become who they really are and become, more open and connected and kinder, and to have better relationships.
Yeah. And this really does extend past one's own circle. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about inflammation in the body and how glucose spikes can contribute to inflammation in the body. But there's also societal inflammation. We don't have to look very far to see kind of this very polarized invective and people just throwing invidious barbs at each other on social media and all that kind of stuff. And I really believe that inflammation on a societal level is a spillover from inflammation in the body, kind of spilling into the body politic. And, if we're able to control inflammation in our own body, I think it's going to go a long way to being able to foster a lot more cooperation and society at large. So, I think the work that you're doing obviously impacts people on a very personal level, but I completely connected to societal well-being. So I'm just, I can't tell you enough how important I think what you're doing is, and how well you're communicating it to so many people. It's having just such a huge impact. And I'm just one of the very few grateful people out of
Jeff.
many, many, many millions of people now that you're touching. So
I'm
really
so
happy
appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I'm so happy to see this book, The Glucose Goddess Method, get out there far and wide, and just grateful for our budding friendship and relationship.
Yes,
So
me too. Thank you, Jeff. Seriously, those words mean a lot, and I just want to help people start, and just want to help people make these changes, and that's what I'm really obsessed with. It's like, how do I help you actually do the thing that you want to do and you want to feel better, but I want to help you take that first step. So thank you so much for having me and for being such a kind supporter of my work. It means a lot.
Yeah, well, I'm aspiring to be a glucose deity.
Yay!
Someday.
You are, Jeff. You're officially a glucose god.
Nice. You've knighted me right here.
Exactly.
In public. All right, Jessie, to be continued. Hopefully we could do it again.
Thank you, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.